Hi and welcome to our ICT class. This is information and communication technology for Zika D4 and 1.6. Our ICT syllabus is got two parts in it. The first part deals with the IT part. This part is more of a practical part, which requires students to have a practical experience on the use of information technology, including the information technology gadgets. And the second part deals with the communication part. The communication part is more of a theory part. So now in our approach, since we're doing our online classes, as you know that there is a lockdown in Zambia, so we are not allowed to do physical classes. I would love to start with the communication part, which is more of theory, hoping that by the time we come to the IT part, which is more of practical, by that time we might be allowed to be meeting for physical classes so that we can do a practical approach to the IT part. Nevertheless, even if that does not happen, we'll see how we can do the IT part online as well. But communication, because it's theory, it's easily done online. All right, so we're going to start with our communication part, and then later on we'll come to our IT part. So let's start by defining what communication is. And by the way, in this particular session, I'm going to deal with the principles and process of communication, which is the first part that we deal with on the communication part. So we're dealing with principles and process of communication. So principles and process of communication. Principles and process of communication. That's what we're dealing with today, principles and process of communication. All right, so let's define what communication is. Now, communication is a social subject. So you'll find different definitions as you look at different materials and different books. You'll find that there are differences in the way communication is defined, but all the definitions must agree on the core facts of communication. So let me pick this definition from your Zika manuals on how we define communication. So communication is defined as the process of exchanging information. So communication is the process of exchanging information. Process of exchanging information. So we end there. So to give you a full definition of what communication is defined as the process of exchanging information, ideas, feelings, emotions, beliefs, and values between two parties. Exchanging of information, ideas, feelings, emotions, beliefs, values between two parties. The short form, we can just say communication is the exchange of information between two parties. So that definition reveals the fact that there are supposed to be two parties in the communication for communication to actually make sense. These two parties that are involved in the communication are the sender and the receiver. So in any communication, we must have one person or group of people whom we are going to call the sender of the information, and on the other side we must have the receiver of information, or the audience of the communication. So two parties that are involved in communication are the sender and the receiver of the information. So that's how we define a communication. Is simply the process of exchanging information, ideas, feelings, beliefs, emotions, values between two parties. The two parties involved in the communication should be the sender of the information and the receiver of the information. Next thing, let me look at the ingredients of communication. We know what ingredients are. Ingredients of communication. What are some of the things that must be present for us to say communication is taking place? So ingredients, we have about 5 ingredients of communication. 5 ingredients of communication. Number 1 is the participants. In any communication, we must have the participants. Which are the people that are involved in that communication. So the participants of the of communication should be the sender and the receivers of information. Number 2, ingredient of information, we must have ingredient of communication, we must have information. Information must be available for communication to take place. Number 3 ingredient of communication is the purpose of communication. What is the motive of communication? What's the purpose of communication? The number 4 ingredient of communication is the medium that is going to be used for communication. The medium of communication. And the last ingredient of communication is simply channels of communication. Channels of communication. So let me run through these ingredients of communication and explain each of these ingredients of communication. Now, number 1, participants. We've already said for communication to take place, there should be 2 parties that are involved in the communication, and the 2 parties that are involved are the sender and the receiver of information. So what role does the sender of information or ideas or feelings has? The roles of the sender are as follows. Number 1, the sender is the one that feels the need to communicate. The sender is the one that feels the need to communicate. The sender, number 2, the sender must collect information or gather information to be communicated. From that information, number 3, the sender must construct or compose a message to be communicated. Number 4, the sender must identify or define the audience to which the communication is targeted. Then number 5, the sender must choose the medium of communication or the channels of communication. Number 6, the sender must transmit the message using an appropriate medium of communication and channel of communication, of course. And finally, the sender should monitor the impact of the communication. So that's what the sender should do in the process of communication. Let me just run through the role of the sender. Feels the need to communicate, gather information for communication, compose the message, identify the audience, choose the medium and channel of communication, transmit the message, monitor the impact of the message. What about the receiver? The receiver should perform the following roles. Number 1, the receiver should recognize himself or herself as the target audience for the communication. The receiver must acknowledge that that person is the targeted audience for the communication or for a particular event. Number 2, the receiver must receive the message. Number 3, the receiver must interpret the message. During the process of interpreting the message, there is some kind of decoding that is taking place. So the receiver must interpret the message. And number 4, the receiver must acknowledge receipt of the message. There should be an acknowledgement that the message has been received. And finally, the receiver must either accept the information or reject the information and give some kind of feedback. Those are the participants of the communication. Ingredient of communication number 2 is the information itself. The information actually is what kickstarts the communication. The information kickstarts the communication. If there is no information to be communicated, communication cannot take place. So usually the one who has a special message or idea or emotions or feelings, this is the sender who feels the need to communicate, must construct the message to be communicated. And this gives rise to the need to engage in communication. However, the information to be communicated must be described in a certain way. So the following are the ways you describe the information to be communicated. Number 1, the information must have a subject. The information must have a subject. So is that subject targeted at an organization? Things like, will the message go to the entire organization? Is the organization the subject matter? Or is it personal? Is the information concerning a particular employee? Things like maybe the promotion of one particular employee, or demotion of that particular employee, or firing of that particular employee. So the subject of the message, of the information, must be clearly stated. Who is the subject matter of the information? Is it everyone in an organization, or is it some individuals in an organization? Number 2, information should also be described by the levels of security. Levels of security talks about how confidential the information is. Is the information confidential or non-confidential? Confidential information should be communicated in a certain way that restricts circulation of that information. If the information is confidential, then it simply means that that information is not meant for everyone. It's meant for specific individuals, and the information must have restricted circulation. It's confidential. Non-confidential information can be accessed by anyone, and so the medium that is used and the channels that is used for that particular communication will be in such a way that anyone can access the information, because it's not confidential. Then number 3, information must be described by the time frame. Is it current information, or is it historical, or is it futuristic kind of information? Ingredient number 3. Ingredient of communication number 3 is the purpose of communication. The purpose of communication talks about the motive for communicating. Why are you engaging in communication? What are we trying to achieve in that communication? That's the purpose of communication. So the purpose of communication could be, maybe you want to share information. Simply sharing information with others, that could be the purpose of communication. Or you want to get the other person do something. That could be another way to describe the purpose of communication. Trying to get other people to do something. More especially if you are a manager, you would love your subordinates to carry certain tasks. For you to achieve that, you need to communicate. So the purpose of communication in that sense would be to try and get those subordinates to do something. Or communication can be done simply to create a sense of being appreciated. Imagine you are a worker that has been serving this company for a period of time, and you want the company to appreciate you. That becomes the purpose of communicating, the purpose of communication. Sometimes the purpose of communication would be to see to it that other person is contributing correctly, or other people are contributing correctly to the organization purposes. Those can be purposes of communicating. In summary, the purpose of communication simply talks about the motive or the reasons for communication. Number 4 is the medium. Number 4 ingredient of communication is the medium of communication. The medium of communication refers to the method that is used in the communication. Method that is used in the communication. The method could be you're going to do the written communication, oral communication, or you're going to use graphs in your communication. What's the medium of communication? What's the method that you're going to use to communicate? And finally, the final ingredient is the channels. Channels refer to the route the message will follow to get to the intended audience. What route will the message follow? Channels of communication, we'll talk about the channels of communication in a little more details later when we talk about different channels of communication and different mediums of communication. But those are the ingredients of communication. So in summary, we have about 5 ingredients of communication, and these things must be present for us to say communication is taking place and communication is working well. All right, so next let's talk about the types of communication. The types of communication. So types of communication. The types of communication. So we have about 5 different types of communication, and these are: number 1, we have interpersonal communication. Before I come to the interpersonal communication, let's start with the intraperson communication. Intrapersonal communication. So intrapersonal communication. Number 2, the interpersonal communication. Number 3 type of communication is small group communication. The 4th type is public communication, and the 5th type is mass communication. So we have those 5 different types of communication. 5 different types of communication. We have 5 different types of communication. So let me just pull that page down. Right. Now let's run through the 5 different types of communication, starting with the intrapersonal communication. So intrapersonal communication, this is the communication that takes place within an individual. Is the internal thought process of the person. It takes place every time. It's the communication that goes on within an individual. It's called intrapersonal communication. So some of the features of intrapersonal communication is that it takes place every time, 24 hours a day. And this intrapersonal kind of communication may be expressed in written form. For example, people keep diaries of their thoughts, ideas, they write down in certain diaries. So that can be expressed in written form. It's called intrapersonal communication. Interpersonal communication, this is where individuals come out of their inner interaction and they begin to communicate between each other. So you're dealing with each other in terms of communication. There is exchange of information between individuals. That's interpersonal communication. The communication is taking place between individuals. Interpersonal communication. Small group communication, one person is addressing a small group of people. One person is addressing a small group of people. It's called small group communication. Public communication is where one person is addressing a crowd of people, a big crowd of people. That's called public communication. So between the small group communication and the public communication, it is simply the size of the audience, the size of the audience. In a small group communication, you have an individual who is actually communicating with a small group of people, and in a public communication, you have an individual who is addressing a crowd of people. In mass communication, you have an individual that is addressing the unconfirmed audience. For example, when you're on radio, print media, you are on TV, you're communicating to a big crowd of people that is unconfirmed audience. That's mass communication. So those are the 5 different types of communication. 5 different types of communication. Let's look at the levels of communication. Levels of communication. Levels of communication. Levels of communication. We have about 3 different levels of communication. We have the formal communication, informal communication, and the grapevine. So number 1, the communication could be formal communication, or the communication could be informal communication. And then we have another special kind of communication which is called the grapevine. The simpler way of defining grapevine is simply organization gossips, the communication that goes around the organization. This, of course, is quite informal kind of communication, the grapevine. And questions that have been asked pertaining the grapevine is whether management should allow and tolerate grapevine organization gossips that goes around in every organization or not. There are different points of view pertaining the grapevine. One is that sometimes the grapevine can work to the advantage of the organization if the rumors that are spread around the organization are to the advantage of the organization, or the rumors are in favor of the organization. Grapevine works to the advantage of the organization. But if the rumors are quite damaging on the image of the organization, then the grapevine is going to work against the growth of the organization. And the other views that are carried out around that grapevine is the fact that managers should not run away from grapevine. They should actually be part of the grapevine, because you can use those small groupings within the organization, then the gossips that goes around, to the advantage of the organization. So it depends. You can use it to gather information for management, or you can use it to spread the information to the rest of the individuals in an organization. All right, so formal communication, this is an interaction in an official way. That's what formal communication is. You are interacting in a more official way, and the outcome of formal communication is quite binding, and it's actionable, and it produces record of the interaction. Usually formal interactions are recorded. And formal interactions, one of the drawbacks is that it may be very slow in getting things done due to the procedures that must be followed if the communication is formal. Informal communication is less official kind of communication, and it's less procedural kind of communication. It takes place in a quite relaxed environment. And it can take place anytime. One of the advantages of informal communication is that it can get things done quite faster because protocols are set aside. Grapevine, I've already talked about Grapevine, organization gossips that goes around within each organization. The Grapevine is quite complex with more potential for distraction, yet it can yield positive results. Distraction if the rumors that are spread within the Grapevine is quite damaging rumors for the organization, but if it's positive information spread around Grapevine, it can work to the advantage of the organization. Managers should not completely abandon Grapevine, but should try to be a part of the communication and try to use those informal social groupings within the organization to gather information and spread or distribute or disseminate information that managers want to communicate to the individuals. Well, this is where I would love to end for today's session. We'll come and pick it up from here in our second session, looking at details about the medium of communication and the channels of communication, but probably just a summary on the medium of communication. Let me just give you a summary on the medium of communication, so that probably in our next session we'll be looking at something different. Medium of communication. We've said medium of communication looks at the method that the communication is taking, the method of communication. And we have the following mediums of communication. Number one, communication could be oral communication. Oral communication involving speech or verbal communication. Communication can also be written communication. Written communication. Or communication could be through expressions, non-verbal, through expressions, which we call non-verbal communication. It could be non-verbal communication. Or communication could be visual communication. Visual, you're trying to show pictures, something that is visual. So those are the mediums of communication. Which medium is more appropriate depends on the purpose for communication and the information that you are trying to communicate. But each of these mediums of communication will have their own advantages and disadvantages. For example, oral communication, one of the advantages is that if you are communicating orally, you get feedback almost immediately. Written communication, you're writing to someone else, it may take time because the other party must read through the message before they give the reply. But in terms of keeping records, written communication will be much better. So if the communication involves something that is legally binding, it's better to use written communication than oral communication. If communication involves certain complex issues, you might decide to use visual. So which method of communication or medium of communication is appropriate depends on the message or information you're communicating. It also depends on the audience. It also depends on how official or how legal the information is. Finally, let me talk about the channels of communication. Channels of communication. Now, channels, we've said channels of communication, this is talking about the route the communication is going to take, the route the communication is taking. So, the channels of communication could be maybe vertical communication. Vertical communication. So it can be vertical upwards or vertical downwards. If the communication is vertical upwards, you are communicating to superiors. Juniors are communicating to superiors. And the purpose of that communication could be the juniors are making a request to a supervisor, or you're seeking permission, or you're giving reports. That is called vertical upwards. Juniors are communicating to superiors, or subordinates are communicating to superiors, and the purpose could be you seeking permission, giving a report, or you're making a request. Vertical downward communication. This is the superiors communicating to subordinates. Vertical downwards, superiors are communicating to subordinates. The purpose of that communication could be the superior is giving instructions, or the superior is trying to persuade a subordinate, or the superior is trying to consult a subordinate. So vertical downwards, it's the seniors communicating to the juniors to instruct them, to consult them, or to persuade them. Communication, the other channel of communication is horizontal communication. Horizontal communication. So horizontal communication is communication that is taking place between colleagues, people at the same level in an organization, communicating to each other. The purpose of communication between colleagues could be to consult. One colleague is consulting the other colleague, or to advise each other, or to simply update each other. That could be the purposes of communicating there. Horizontal communication. That's people who are at the same level communicating to each other. It's the communication between colleagues. Now, diagonal communication is another channel of communication. So the other channel of communication could be diagonal. So diagonal communication is where either juniors or seniors of one particular department are communicating to juniors or seniors of another particular department. So communication across departments. That's diagonal communication. So it can be diagonal upwards. The juniors of one department are communicating to the superiors of another department. Juniors of one department communicating to the superiors of another department in the direct line of command. Diagonal downwards, the seniors of one particular department is communicating to a subordinate of another particular department in the same line of command, of course. So the other way we can explain diagonal is this. Diagonal upwards, colleagues to superiors are communicating to the juniors in the same line of command. Diagonal downwards is the communication to the colleagues to subordinates, one's junior who are not accountable to him. The other way is just to say diagonal communication is taking place across departments. So it could be diagonal upwards or diagonal downwards. That concludes our introduction to communication, of course looking at the principles and process of communication. So let me just run through what we have learned today. We have talked about the definition of communication, where we said communication is simply the process of exchanging information, ideas, feelings, emotions between two parties. For communication to take place, two parties must be involved. That is the sender and the receiver of information. We've also talked about the ingredients of communication, which includes participants, the information, the purpose, medium, and the channel of communication. And we've also talked about the types of communication: intrapersonal communication within a person, interperson between individuals, small group communication, one person is addressing a small group, public communication, one person is addressing a large group, Mass communication, one person is addressing undefined audience. The audience is undefined in that level. We've also talked about the levels of communication: formal communication, informal, and the grapevine that takes place within every organization. Then we've talked about the medium of communication, which is simply methods of communication. It could be oral, written, non-verbal, or visual communication. And finally, we've looked at the channels of communication, the route that the communication is taking place. It could be vertical, vertical upwards, vertical downwards. It could be horizontal between colleagues. It could be diagonal across departments. It could be diagonal upwards or diagonal downwards. Thank you so much for your time. See you in the next video.